Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight to our speaker series event. Tonight's event is in partnership with the Cold Regions Research Center. Before we get too far along, the LCSC would like to acknowledge that we are located on the traditional territories of the Attawandaron, Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples, and we recognize the continuing presence of Indigenous peoples and cultures here. The consequences of the long colonial relationship between the Government of Canada and the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples are far-reaching and painful. LCSC is committed to reconciliation through the establishment and maintenance of a mutually respectful relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. First, I would love to introduce Homa Keirolapour, faculty member at Laurier in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies and the Executive Director of the Cold Regions Research Center.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you, Emily, for introduction. So as she introduced, I'm a faculty member at Geography and Environmental Studies and Executive Director of Cold Region Research Center. For those unfamiliar with the Cold Region Research Center, CRRC, so we are established in 1987, evolving from a major multidisciplinary research and training project focused on snow and ice hydrology, lots of Arctic and mountain glaciology. And today our focus expanded for both physical and social science in cold regions. So please visit our website at coldregions.ca and also follow us on social media. So today we are pleased to partner with LCSC to co-host this event. It's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Matthew Wiseman, who will be presenting on a frontier science, the rise and fall for Fort Churchill. Dr. Wiseman is an assistant professor at University of Waterloo. He has published extensively on international history and the role of military science with the content of Canadian defense and national security during Cold War. His work includes a monograph on the history of science in Northern Canada and the Canadian Arctic from 45 to 70s. And without further ado, please join me to welcoming Dr. Wiseman on stage. We are looking forward to your talk.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to Emily for that very kind introduction. I just want to, before I begin, certainly extend my thanks to Eric Story, who gave me the invitation to be here with you all tonight. Certainly extend my thanks to Matt Baker and Kevin Spooner and the kind folks here at what is now the Laurier Center for the Study of Canada. And certainly extend my thanks as well to the Cold Regions Research Center for being a co-sponsor of this evening tonight. It's a pleasure for me to be back here and to share with you information about my recent publication, my book. Let's see if we can go to the slide first. Perfect, here it is. Frontier Science, Northern Canada Military Research, and the Cold War. I first moved to the Kitchener-Waterloo region 12 years ago now, in the fall of 2012, and I began at that time a wide-eyed PhD student here at Wilfrid Laurier University. And it's such a great pleasure for me to be back here at the Laurier Center for the Study of Canada. When I started here at Wilfrid Laurier, this center was the Laurier Center for Military, Strategic, and Disarmament Studies, and I was brought in under the tutelage of Kevin Spooner and others such as Terry Coppin and Roger Sardi. And it was this project, actually Frontier Science, and this book actually started in the basement of this very building. One of the individuals that I studied here at Laurier as part of my doctoral research was a nuclear physicist by the name of George Lindsey. Here he is on the slide. Dr. Lindsey passed away in 2011. He was a nuclear physicist who trained at Cambridge. During the Second World War, he performed operational research for the British and for the Canadian military. Operational research in this context during the Second World War, the focus of Lindsey's work as a nuclear physicist was studying in particular of the bomb threat, the aerial threat to England, to Britain during the Second World War. Think in the context of the Battle of Britain, think of course of the German V1 flying bomb. Well, nuclear physics, and in this individual, certainly Lindsey and others, who performed operational research studying the actual military threat of the new German technology in this respect. He would study missiles, essentially the world's first cruise missiles, from a scientific perspective, from the perspective of not only nuclear physics, but certainly physics in this respect. And what that meant was, yes, we understand certainly, what a cruise missile is in purpose, but what were the actual technical or technological capabilities of that weapon system? Apply that to the early Cold War period. Of course, we moved rapidly in the span of some 10 to 15 years from long-range bombers being the primary means to deliver potentially a nuclear payload to a foreign target, say from the Soviet Union to North America, to, of course, the development of missiles, ballistic missiles of intercontinental range. But did those missiles carrying a nuclear payload, could they actually target, say, perhaps a city in the Great Lakes region of North America? And what were the accuracy of those delivery systems? And this was important because Lindsey, of course, conducted this research while Canada was working in lockstep with partners south of the border in the division, of course, in the creation of what would later become the North American Air Defense Radar Network. So he was one of a number of scientists that were brought into Canada's Department of National Defense in the early Cold War years, who would apply, of course, their knowledge, their expertise, and their research to study issues of military, study issues of strategy, study issues of defense from a scientific and a technical point of view. He was able to do this because he was an employee of what was known as Canada's Defense Research Board. This was an organization in Canada that was established under the umbrella of Canada's Department of National Defense. But once the Cold War began in 1946 and 1947, in the years immediately following the Second World War, at that point in time, Canada did not have a branch of the federal government devoted strictly to military R&D, devoted strictly to military science. The responsibility for military science before 1947, before the creation of the Defense Research Board, was under the purview of another body, the National Research Council, which itself was formed in the midst of war during the First World War, 1916, modeled after similar establishments south of the border of the United States, and more importantly, across the pond in England with the United Kingdom. But the National Research Council was not a military research organization in principle. In practice, sure, it turned out to be very much that during a little bit the First World War, but predominantly during the Second World War, because Canada had a void in this area. The National Research Council would take funding from the federal budget and funnel that funding to university scientists in a variety of fields in the social and physical sciences during the Second World War. And through this research, scientists then were able to contribute to Canada's national war effort. But again, we have this core problem. During the Second World War, that the Army, the Navy, the Air Force worked in partnership with scientists and others in the National Research Council. But there was no single organization devoted to military R&D, which is one of the reasons that in the years immediately following the Second World War, officials in the Department of National Defense would put their minds together and would determine that Canada needed its own research organization, what will become, of course, the Defense Research Board, now known today as Defense Research and Development Canada, an organization that is still in existence. On this slide, you see the rough timeline of Canadian science in this regard. The National Research Council being formed during the First World War in 1916, the Defense Research Board in the early years, of course, of the Cold War, 1947. And in those years, Canada did not have a national science policy. Science in this regard was very much ad hoc. It very much depended upon the officials in the Department of National Defense, who were tasked with not only taking money from the national defense budget, but as I say, allocating that money outward, recruiting scientists from universities across the country in order to support the military research needs of Canada as they expanded and changed and evolved rapidly and quickly. So we have the creation of the Defense Research Board, as I say, the predecessor of the Defense Research and Development Canada, really being modeled on the National Research Council, but at the same time alleviating the NRC of its responsibility for military research. This is important, certainly for a number of reasons. And it sets the foundation for my talk here today, which is, of course, Canada's Arctic military research program during the early decades of the Cold War. If not for the founding of the Defense Research Board, if not for the money provided to academic and university scientists in Canada during the early Cold War period, the research that I'm sharing with you today and the book, of course, that was published based on that research would not exist. Here is the emblem, the logo of what was created, the Defense Research Board, again, in April of 1947. Now, this was important for a number of reasons. One, because it would provide money, again, from the national defense budget in order to fund or support military research in Canadian universities. This would also support the training of scientists and graduate students, and it would enable scientists as well to work in lockstep with the three services and to travel to distant, perhaps remote areas of Canada, areas that are geographically perhaps difficult to get to in this period, of course, using the infrastructure and connections vis-a-vis the Department of National Defense. But what was the power? What was the influence of this body, right? If we think about the Defense Research Board, and we think about military R&D, and we think about that, how that was applied in the context of the early Cold War, I think we need to, again, think about the position of those scientists within the structure of the Department of National Defense. Here is Dr. Oman Solant. I mentioned, of course, George Lindsey, an operational researcher, a nuclear physicist from the Second World War, a friend and colleague of Dr. Oman Solant, who would recruit George Lindsey into the Defense Research Board, the new organization created in 1947 under this individual's direction. Oman Solant was himself a medical scientist. He trained at the University of Toronto under Charles Best. He himself was an operational researcher during the Second World War. He was one of a number of scientists who would travel to Japan to witness, observe, and study the effects of nuclear radiation on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the aftermath of the atomic bombings. He himself would become Canada's first Director General of Defense Research in the early Cold War, a position that was created solely for this individual because he was recruited by senior officials in national defense. He was also become the first chair of the Defense Research Board, a position that he held between 1947 and 1956. But consider this. Here we have a medical scientist, trained also as an individual, certainly with military or service experience from the Second World War. But he was brought into the structure of the Department of National Defense not as a military personnel or official, but rather as a civilian. He was the senior most civilian in the Department of National Defense at the time. Also the senior most scientist in the Department of National Defense during his years as chair of the Defense Research Board. He was intelligent. He could be arrogant. He had the ear of senior military officials which he conversed, sat around the table, discussed issues with respect to classified information, with respect to secret information that perhaps was shared with the Canadian government in confidence, say from counterparts in the US or the UK, on important issues with respect to Canadian defense, national security, nuclear weapons, biological, chemical agents. He was, yes, the Director General of Defense Research, But that was a broad and sweeping title. As I mentioned, this was a position that was created for this individual. And in his years as chair of the DRB, he would not only bring this Defence Research Board, the fourth branch of Canada's military, to the fore, but he would also be very central to determining the mandate. And importantly, as I have stressed, allocating funding from the national defense budget to prioritize certain research projects. One of those projects was Arctic research, right? The question of taking military personnel across all three services, Army, Navy, and Air Force, and training those personnel to potentially fight and thrive in an Arctic environment, in an Arctic climate, in a region of the world that was considered from an outsider perspective to be harsh, to be dangerous, to be extremely difficult from a military perspective and point of view. These were lessons, of course, learned from previous conflicts. Most recently, in this case, of course, the Second World War. Here is, it might be a little bit difficult to see, the organizational structure of the Defence Research Board. Not to delve too deeply into the institutional history of the DRB, but just to note quickly. What we see here is that in his position as chair of the Defence Research Board, Olman Soldat was on equal footing with the chiefs of staff. Equal footing with the head of the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force. One step below the Minister of National Defense. Also on equal footing with the Deputy Minister of National Defense. And consider again a civilian scientist holding this role. Not only did he have the ear of senior military officials, but he himself was a senior military official in the Department of National Defense. Quite significant. Consider as well the amount of money put at the disposal of this individual. Might be difficult to see on this slide. The Defence Research Board, under the direction of Olman Soldat, would fund a number of areas of scientific research, engineering, technological development in the early years of the Cold War. Here is a slide between 1947 and the early 1960s. What I want to discuss with you today are two of these areas. But for those in the room who might have difficulty seeing, this lists everything from atomic warfare, biological warfare, gas dynamics, entomological research, which is the study of insects and bugs. I'll get to that later in my talk today. The science of radiation, how to protect individuals potentially from nuclear fallout, to explosive propellants. And importantly, human resources research and Arctic medical research. Now, human resources research, that might sound a little bit odd. In this context, what that refers to is actually science applied to engineer the human body to withstand extreme environments or extreme climates. Was that possible, for instance, to have a human body better adapt to a cold climate? Was cold weather acclimatization possible to study biologically, geophysically? And how could those lessons be applied in a military context? Applying those scientific lessons and those advances to the Canadian military, to give the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and give those personnel an advantage if they needed to fight or protect or defend Canada, again, in a cold climate. Arctic medical research, another area, between 1947 and 1960. More than 100 different individual projects funded under the Department of National Defense vis-a-vis the Defence Research Board for this research, with millions of dollars being doled out. Again, most of this research was funneled to academic scientists, scientists who would agree contractually to perform secret research for the Department of National Defense. These individuals who held university posts across the country would sign, and did sign, oaths of secrecy, restricting the amount of information that they could openly share in public about their research, openly share in a setting such as this with scientific colleagues, perhaps at conferences, also restricting publication. in open scientific literature. The Defense Research Board would institute a public relations staff in the early 1950s who held the responsibility of vetting research that was meant to be published in the open literature or made available to the public. And what we can see here on this slide is the number of different university or academic institutions across Canada who would have received money from the Defense Research Board specifically for military research. It's a lot of details, a lot of numbers. The basic point is this. Between the years on this slide, 1947 and the early 1960s, 20% of Canada's entire national defense budget was earmarked specifically for scientific research and engineering research. 20%. For comparative purposes, in the same years, upwards of 80 or 90% of the entire US budget went into R&D. Right, but we're not comparing apples to oranges in that respect. It's important. It was a lot of money, and it certainly had implications or consequences. Here is an advertisement that was sent out in the mid-1950s to universities across Canada, advertising that there was money available for military R&D, and that this was available not only for academics who held a post, but for their graduate students as well. And these advertisements did work. Old man Solent would reach out to his network of scientists and colleagues in Canada formed during and after the Second World War, and would very much extend opportunities. This was another pool of money that scientists and engineers across Canada could tap into to pursue their scientific curiosities. Pulled into the world of military research, in part because of the Cold War. Certainly, that's what I argue in my book. Here is what I want to focus on. One of a number of establishments funded and created by the Defense Research Board, a map of Canada. Today, I want to direct your attention to Churchill, northern Manitoba, on the shore of Hudson Bay, geographically situated, of course, in the center of Canada, not in the Arctic, in subarctic Canada, on the tree line and how it was described. Soldiers and scientists from southern areas of Canada, from Britain and the United States, from the Soviet Union, from other locations, would travel to this area during the first 2 decades of the Cold War to perform military research with soldiers, sailors, with aviators, with Indigenous peoples as well. This was a central hub of scientific research for Canada, and it was also important for establishing Canada's defense and security relations in the aftermath of the Second World War, because this was an area that was considered unique. I refer to this in my book as Canada's long Second World War. And what I mean by that is the idea that military and defense officials in the Department of National Defense approached the early Cold War period as a time of continued warfare. Right? The enemy had changed. It was no longer Germany, it was no longer Japan. Communism was on the rise, perhaps spreading around the world. A fear of that spread, of course, would come to the fore. The Soviet Union, China as well. But how military and defense officials approached the problems of their day, the work that they performed, was very similar to that of the Second World War. Again, the enemy had changed, the issues and challenges had changed, but the solution was to carry forward a wartime mindset into the post-war period. This is what I refer to as Canada's long Second World War. It was also central to establishing and strengthening Canada's connection and defense fortifications in this period. Canada did not have the resources, financial or physical, didn't have the people to defend northern Canada nor the Arctic without support from the United Kingdom, without support, importantly, from the US. Fort Churchill was established during the Second World War because the US thought that this was an important node on an air route, which was a transportation network connecting the continent of North America to Europe across the Atlantic, in case the Allies needed an evacuation route. That airfield that was constructed at Churchill during the Second World War was constructed in part by US soldiers and with US funding, US Army of Engineers. Canada would enter the fold, of course, was well aware of US interests in this area during the Second World War, and would continue to put more resources into Churchill in the aftermath. Again, this was central to how Canada envisioned itself, primarily because this was an area that was considered unique to Canadian geography. And Canadians, scientists and engineers, were considered by their counterparts in the UK and the US to have a certain special knowledge or an expertise in the cold, in the north, in the Arctic and subarctic. I use the term Arctic research in my book as a general reference to research about northern Canada and the Arctic, which could include research that was actually conducted within the Arctic Circle, but it could also include research that was conducted in subarctic Canada, outside the geographical boundary itself. This was in part because military and defense officials from the South misunderstood the geographical challenges of this area. They misunderstood the difficulty of actually taking individuals from the South, regardless of service, and placing them in an environment and a climate that was unfamiliar to them. Physically, in terms of the human body, but psychologically as well. Well, I titled my talk here with you tonight, Fear and Fatigue. I was described as the initial response of the outside soldier to the Churchill environment. Right? This was an area, of course, was important for a number of reasons. One, it was Churchill, so they had a deep water seaport with Hudson Bay. Churchill was accessible by air with the airstrip established during the Second World War. It was also accessible by rail with the Hudson Bay terminal. And soldiers who would arrive to Churchill predominantly arrived by rail, witnessing firsthand the changes of the landscape as they would travel north. Most soldiers would arrive at Churchill via Winnipeg, fly into Winnipeg, and then take the rail. 1 or 2 days on train, depending on time of year, depending on weather. And they would witness firsthand the tree line, the changes to the landscape of Manitoba, and some of the challenges that these individuals would encounter when they landed. Churchill, Manitoba, polar bear capital of the world. Here is the Churchill Northern Studies Center, a modern eco-friendly research center located near the former Fort Churchill military base that I want to speak with you today. This is also the location of what was known as a Churchill research range, a rocketeer range for atmospheric research. Not only was Churchill significant for a number of reasons, because the military had a foothold in the region, in the immediate area, but Churchill was also close to the North Magnetic Pole, an area of maximum aurora activity. If you think about that in the military context, think about how magnetism might disrupt radio communications, might disrupt in-flight instruments, might disrupt a magnetic compass and render that obsolete. And what do those challenges then represent for a soldier trying to navigate in an area, in a region that is largely foreign to that individual, trying to communicate with fellow soldiers? This is also the remnants of Churchill of old, now decommissioned. The research range still stands, not operational. Here is the core of my book. This is DRNL, Defense Research Northern Laboratory. This was the scientific research center established by the Defense Research Board at Fort Churchill, in which scientists, engineers would travel to conduct research on military personnel as human subjects, both inside the laboratory, but outside in the natural elements. This was one of many buildings constructed as part of the wider Fort Churchill military base. Here's that juxtaposition to which I referred. Take a soldier from southern Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, and drop them in Churchill, Manitoba, subarctic, an area, of course, with large and expanding indigenous population, also located on the shores of Hudson Bay, not only a permanent Indigenous population, but a transient population as well. And as part of their approach to understanding Arctic research and Arctic science, scientists and engineers would not only train their focus on the southern soldier and adapting that soldier in both mind and body to the northern environment, but they would also study Indigenous peoples, and Inuit in particular, individuals who were thought to have a special knowledge and perhaps a biological adaptation to the northern environment, northern climate. This was the focus of a film produced in cooperation with the Defense Research Board and the National Film Board in 1948. It was a short film, one in a series that were actually shown to Canadians in southern Canada as a theater short. This would project an image of northern Canada as an area that was harsh, as an area and a region that needed to be overcome, that needed to be defeated from a military point of view. Here is that tree line that I was referring to, and you can see the rough geographical distinction, right, with the treed areas, and above that, the Arctic Circle. Here is images of soldiers arriving to Fort Churchill, disrupting the land, disrupting the local community, trying to understand how it is not only to potentially live and fight, but to survive in this area as well. This would involve scientific study of not only the human body, but of military kit, equipment, and the like. Of course, it included military exercises, how to train personnel, and how to indoctrinate personnel as well. In the cold, this is for winter warfare purposes. This was, as I say, also to study whether or not military equipment could actually be used effectively and efficiently in a climate, right? It wasn't necessarily the idea or the threat that the Soviet Union or another body would attack Canada in this period. But Canada needs to be prepared for all potential military circumstances or situations, potential conflict zones. And an Arctic or a cold weather climate was considered one such important military conflict zone in which soldiers needed to be prepared to fight in, as well as their equipment, of course. Here you can see an image, and I'll just point to you the image on your right. This individual has on his face goggles. I mentioned military equipment. One of the issues that soldiers would encounter operating in Churchill on the Barrens near Fort Churchill during the winter months was what was referred to as snow blindness. Sun reflecting off the snow, and of course, difficulty with seeing and observation. What that might mean to interrupt military operations. So individuals, scientists, engineers would devise a series of goggles, sunglasses, devised specifically for this research, and specifically for military personnel who might operate in this area. Again, here is another image of some of the military exercises, again, testing weapons and equipment. And after these weapons and equipment were tested in the north, what lessons could be learned, and importantly, how could those lessons be transported south to laboratories? How could those issues be doled out and provided to scientists and engineers in order to find solutions, to devise perhaps more durable weapons or durable equipment, specifically then suited to an Arctic or a cold weather climate? But it was this knowledge and this approach that was also race-based. The notion that applying Western or present-day science and engineering could not only perfect, but improve upon Indigenous traditional knowledge with respect to living, traversing, and indeed fighting in this area. There were Indigenous peoples with the Canadian Rangers who would cooperate and would participate in some exercises with personnel at Churchill. But Indigenous peoples would also be a subject for scientific research. Stoves are particularly useful and getting more attention today in the late 1940s because they are essential to civilized man as a cooking tool for warmth. Right? If a soldier needed to fight in this area of Canada, that soldier needed to be comfortable. So the military attempted to replicate all Southern amenities, not only at the Fort Churchill base, but out in military exercises as well. You could imagine the implications of having a stove within a tent and what that means for issues of exhaust. Carrying extra equipment and packs and heavy loads was difficulty for soldiers as well. Here's one example of some of the race-based theories or knowledge that was applied in this context. Quote, the Eskimo may not know it, but his dress is scientifically efficient and it's still air and insulation. What this notices and recognizes is that Indigenous clothing and Inuit attire was superior to Southern clothing, was superior to military clothing of the soldiers, and sailors and aviators who trained in Churchill. This was something not noticed by soldiers themselves primarily, but by the scientists who observed the soldiers while they were training. And the scientists would take this knowledge and try to replicate Indigenous attire in this regard, try to improve upon Indigenous attire and apply those lessons, again, to improve military kit and clothing. One of those individuals was George Malcolm Brown, who studied at Queen's University. And he would conduct a series of experiments for more than a decade with funding from the Department of National Defense and the Defense Research Board. And he would study Inuit from a biological perspective, taking samples of blood, urine, skin, and studying that in a comparative framework with samples taken from white soldiers and from white medical students in other areas of the country. The research attempted to determine whether cold acclimatization actually existed biologically. In the end, the research was false, but it was pursued nonetheless. And importantly, this was research that was civilian, that was brought into the military world because it might have a military applicability. If the secrets to cold weather acclimatization could be determined, could be unlocked by scientists such as Brown, then those lessons theoretically could be applied and could be useful for military soldiers and personnel, again, if they had to fight in a cold weather climate. And this was the general approach to northern Canada and the Arctic, one that was a hostile region, but also one that was a laboratory for research in terms of the natural environment and understanding the climate as such. Here's another individual, Alan Burton at Western University. This research was not only conducted at Churchill in the north, it was also conducted in southern labs. One of those labs was in London, Ontario, at the University of Western Ontario, where Alan Burton would perform cold weather experiments on volunteer medical students, individuals who would strip their clothing down and lie naked in an air-conditioned room. And Alan Burton and others in his research team would study this, would study the effect of cold on the human body. We wear a toque in the winter. One of the reasons we do so is because of the research from Alan Burton. He was the first to show that heat dissipates from the head, more so than any other aspect of the human body. That was research funded by the Defense Research Board. This research also took place in Toronto at another establishment of the Defense Research Board known as Defense Research Medical Laboratories, where volunteer soldiers were subjected to different forms of tests, again, to understand potentially the limits of the human body, right? Think about G-forces. Think about hypothermia. Think about the impact of water and other elements that were studied, again, not only in a natural environment, but simulated in cold laboratories as well. Here's research that was performed on primates. Hundreds of animals and primates would go under the knife in Toronto as part of this research. Under the direction of Wilfred Bigelow, individuals and scientists in Toronto would study hypothermia for the Defense Research Board. One of the civilian offshoots of that research was the development of hypothermia for open heart surgery. When the human body is cooled, open heart surgery becomes safer. This is one of the lessons that scientists would learn because of their military research. Out of that research would also come the development of the pacemaker. There were civilian benefits to military research, and it's important to consider that as part of this context. Just to highlight a couple more examples before I move on. Military officials and scientists in particular, who were directing this research, of course, were concerned about monotonous work environments. What if, potentially, an operator in a radar booth on the distant early warning line, Pine Tree line, or the Mid-Canada line, what if that operator falls asleep at the job? That might be an issue, of course, for nuclear defense in the atomic age. So scientists at Defense Research Medical Laboratories in Toronto would study this from a physiological and psychological perspective, which is shown here on the image on the right, on your left. The image on the right, in line with hypothermia research, again, understanding not only the limits potentially of the body who might be subjected, but as well as their clothing and their kit. Here's the second film that I was referring to. This was Vigil in the North in 1954. I just include a selection of images from the film to orient you to Fort Churchill, the former military base that is now demolished. It's now the site of the Churchill Airport. Here's some research that took place inside the laboratory. This is another race-based experiment. You'll see in the image on your right, a soldier lying flat on their back with a scientist in the foreground. At the right of that image is an Inuk, an indigenous man. Here, the close-up allows me to explain the research. You can see the apparent pain on the face of the soldier, whereas the Inuk, the indigenous man, has apparently no pain because of this experiment. What you do not see is that the finger, index finger of each subject, is placed inside of a device, and inside that device is water, and scientists are controlling the temperature of that water. This shows and represents to the viewer of this film the idea that Inuit are somehow superior in cold weather settings, that they can handle severe extreme temperatures more so than a Southern soldier. And therefore, this scientific research again might be applicable. Here is that device that I was referring to, with the pain intensity scale registered on the left. Soldiers would return from Korea, 1953, on rail, shown here, arriving at Churchill in numbers. Not all soldiers, not all personnel who would arrive for training at Churchill would undergo scientific testing as human research subjects. Those that did volunteered. They could receive extra pay, danger pay. They could receive extra leave for their services. I mentioned that this was research in the laboratory. It was also research outside the laboratory as well. What you can see here is scientists recording the physiological responses of personnel, again, to cold, to wind. And this was research primarily conducted on the face, where engineers and scientists and the Defense Research Board wanted to create some sort of face shield for soldiers in this region. And of course, you need to understand how the body responds to that adverse climatic factors if you want to devise technology in order to support or aid the soldier as such. Here's a quick slide. Might be difficult for you to read. This was a question of morale as well. Psychological research performed on soldiers, asking their soldiers about their experience. Do you enjoy winter warfare? Do you enjoy cooking and tenting out in the severe cold on the barrens? Would you rather be in the south, or would you rather be out of this area completely? As you can imagine, most did not necessarily enjoy the experience, especially those subjected to research, because these were individuals who were told, please remove your gloves. Remove your earmuffs. Perhaps take off your coat. Let's study that and see again if there might be lessons to be learned. An important distinction to be made, and I'll we're towards the end of my talk here, is the distinction between Arctic warfare and winter warfare. This was something, of course, that military and defense officials recognized, scientists did as well. Arctic warfare refers to warfare all year round. The North is not just a place of cold, not just a place of wind and snow and darkness. During the summer, more temperate months, boggy conditions in the tundra could produce swarms of mosquitoes, black flies, bugs, insects that would also be an impediment to soldiers trying to operate effectively and potentially fight, in this climate. So the Defense Research Board would bring in entomologists to study bugs. Which clothing attracted mosquitoes or biting flies more than other? Did color play into this factor? And again, a mosquito net. How might this be an impediment for the soldier in terms of disrupting their field of view or ability to operate in the environment? Here's entomologists performing a radioactive experiment. Radioactive phosphorus purchased from the United States, transported north to Churchill. And essentially what scientists are doing in this slide is creating radioactive mosquitoes, using radioactive phosphorus to mark or tag mosquitoes and understand how those black flies and mosquitoes disperse in a northern environment. Again, all for the purposes of understanding the natural considered impediments to the soldier in their operational environment. Tagging or marking mosquitoes with radioactive phosphorus was a common practice in the period, which did not mean an environmental threat or ecological threat. This radiation would decay and would not represent a threat, nor were soldiers subjected to bites from radioactive mosquitoes. It was meant to study, again, mosquitoes and the threat they represented in this context. The research, as you can imagine, in northern Canada and the Arctic would also turn to the problem of nuclear fallout. There were more than 2,000 nuclear and thermonuclear devices detonated all over the world during the early Cold War between July of 1945 and the signing of the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963. Many of those were exploded, of course, in Nevada, the Nevada test site. Some were exploded by the British in southern Australia. Others were exploded in the Soviet Arctic, Novoye Zemlya, and other locations. The concern that health officials and defense officials had in Canada was that fallout was concentrated on northern Canada, in particular because of the escalation, the size, and the extent of the Soviet nuclear testing facilities and program performed in the Arctic. Fallout that would disseminate over the Arctic and concentrate in northern vegetation. This was research conducted in partnership with the Defense Research Board and the Department of National Health and Welfare. The individual on this slide on the left is P.G. Marr. He's looking at a map of Canada, and there's dots on that map which correspond to areas of military bases that were used to actually trace how fallout had disseminated across areas of Canada. But this research would also point Canadian health officials to the north, because fallout in the mid-1950s and into the 1960s was considered to be a unique threat in northern Canada and the Arctic. So to study this, health officials required game, because if game consume northern vegetation and that vegetation contains radionuclides, that might be an indication then of fallout. This research was also applied in a human context, where residents of northern Canada and the Arctic, including Indigenous peoples, who had medical treatment services performed because of pathological research, human samples were taken and assessed as part of this research. Urine analysis, samples of blood, and samples of organs. as well in some cases. In the end, it was determined that yes, radioactive fallout did pose a unique threat in northern Canada and the Arctic, and this was something that led officials in the Department of National Defense, the French Research Board, and the others that they cooperated with in the Department of National Health and Welfare to devise what they referred to as a northern fallout study, to study this problem on a large scale. And that's where you see some of the analysis, some of the documents on this slide. Here's a map of where radioactive fallout concentrated in particular, as identified by officials in both the Department of National Defense and in the Department of National Health and Welfare. Importantly, these were sites in northern Canada and the Arctic in which the military had operated, had a presence. There were 2 locations in Canada in this period that had military hospitals that treated both civilian and military personnel, as well as their dependents. One was Churchill, the other was Whitehorse. And that network, established in part because of funding under the umbrella of the Department of National Defense, and of course other branches of the federal government, I've named the Department of National Health and Welfare, was absolutely central, because you needed to put people in these areas to perform this research, to conduct samples, to get and collect data, and again, to transport that data to labs in the South for radiochemical analysis or others. So in the end, what can we say? What lessons can be learned from this period of Canadian history? This focus on northern Canada and the Arctic. Why was it that military and defense officials at the end of the Second World War considered this to be an area of unique, and to consider this to be an opportunity for Canada and Canadians to make a mark? Well, one, it was geography, of course. Canada had the areas, it had also the personnel, and it had limited resources, but nonetheless, the capabilities and the motivations were there to transport people from southern areas of the country into the north in order to study the natural elements from a human perspective, physiologically, biologically, psychologically. And that motivation is key. But that motivation, as I've said and reiterated off the top, also needed financial support. But in order to bolster Canada's security and national defense in this period, it wasn't just taking soldiers or aviators or sailors and placing them in a northern environment. This was a show of force as well to our friends south of the border in the United States, across the pond in the United Kingdom. And that show of force and show of support was central as well. Because Canada, by focusing on Fort Churchill, by devoting resources to this area of the country and to this area of military R&D in the early Cold War period, was able to tap into funding, resources, expertise, and experience of both the US and the UK. And that was also central to how Canada waged the Cold War. But importantly, what I argue and what I contend in my book is that we need to consider the role of science and scientific expertise in this context. After studying the Defense Research Board for more than a decade, after studying human experiments, after studying the role of soldiers, sailors, and aviators in a northern context, I've come to the conclusion that science and scientific expertise was central to how Canada waged the Cold War in the years after the Second World War. Again, I referred to this earlier in my talk as Canada's long Second World War. Do scientists and engineers in defense research and development in Canada today have the ear of military officials in the same way that they did at the end of the Second World War and during the early Cold War? I don't know. That's a question for future research. But there was a unique relationship between scientist and military official, between scientist and soldier. And that relationship was cultivated in part because of the experiences of the Second World War, in which many of the scientists who would work for the Defense Research Board had the mark of military service. But they also had the respect of senior officials in the Department of National Defense. And they would use that respect as a way to bolster Canada's security and national defense. They had influence and they used it. And they prioritized certain areas in Arctic research conducted below the Arctic Circle, but also within or above the Arctic Circle mattered. This was an area of Canadian expertise that scientists bought into. And importantly, they argued. Scientists were the experts, Canadian scientists and engineers were the experts on cold, were the experts on the North. Here's an example of those resources. An MGM-18 Lacrosse missile, a US surface-to-air missile launched off of a military vehicle being tested in cold weather trials just outside of Fort Churchill. Tapping into US resources, enabling US research on Canadian territory. Cover of my book, A Soldier on Exercise Sweetbriar in 1950. If scientists were important to how Canada waged the Cold War, soldiers, sailors, and aviators also played their part. But these were individuals who were told where to stand, what to do, how to operate, not just in a military context in terms of operational efficiency and effectiveness, but also from a scientific point of view as well. Consider this, Colonel Strom Galloway. The Army would pull out of Fort Churchill in 1964. Galloway was Fort Churchill's last commander. Nothing has ever been made until the soldier has made safe the field where the building shall be built, and the soldier is the scaffolding until it has been built. And the soldier gets no reward but honor. When I reflect upon those words, a lot certainly comes to mind. But I think about the power and influence of the scientists. Individuals in the West who would contribute certainly to Allied victory during the Second World War and would hold power and prestige. And they would wield that influence during the early Cold War. What did that mean for Canada? What did it mean for Canadians? And what did it mean for soldiers who were caught up in this as well? I'll leave my comments there for now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello again. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Just a quick reminder for the question and answer. You can ask questions throughout on Zoom through the Q&A function. And then for those of you in person with us, please wait until you get the microphone to ask your question. All right? I think we can start with a question in the room here. Does anyone here have a question? All right.
Since we're part of NATO, are we, supplying other nations within the NATO information? Are we all sharing the same information?
So within a NATO context, of course, NATO in 1949, in that respect.
Yeah.
Yes, certainly so. In the context of the early Cold War, there was information exchange amongst NATO nations, and that information was exchanged with respect to the Arctic warfare projects that I've mentioned. In terms of the actual services that would train or participate in military exercises or indoctrination at Churchill, those were Canada, the US, and the UK primarily. Now, the one caveat that I will throw into the mix is nuclear weapons research and research on radiation. Canada did not get access to the Nevada test site, for instance, until 1955 because of secrecy with regard to the Manhattan Project and with regard to secrecy of the US nuclear weapons program. So there was certainly an exchange of information within a NATO context, and certainly within signatories to the treaty. But there was also, of course, it would depend on the type of research and the type of information that was exchanged. From a Canadian point of view, though, exchanging information with allied partners was meant to be beneficial, was meant to augment Canada's limited resources in terms of the national defense budget, in terms of personnel and capabilities. And it was, I think, based on my understanding, of the research that I've completed, I think it was a successful strategy in that respect. Thank you.
We'll take this question over here.
Did the Americans have a similar facility in Alaska?
Yes. Excellent question. At Fairbanks, in particular, in Alaska, the U.S. Air Force, in particular, had its own research establishment at Fairbanks, and there was certainly a significant amount of exchange that would take place between scientists on both sides of the border. The difference there, in my understanding and the research that I've completed, I know many references of American scientists traveling to Fort Churchill. Very seldom do you see references of Canadian scientists traveling to Fairbanks with respect to the U.S. Air Force. But there was an exchange of information. There was similar type of research that would take place at Fairbanks with the U.S. Air Force with respect to cold weather acclimatization and, understanding, of course, the geographical and climatic impediments, as I've described, of a northern setting in that sense. But yes, very much so.
Are there any other questions in the room right now? Yep, go ahead.
How would you compare the Arctic with Siberia and, of course, the owners of both?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. It actually provides an opportunity for me to explain a little bit more of the context. So I mentioned, of course, Canada's long Second World War. One of the reasons that the research experiments that I explained in my talk here today, one of the reasons that they took place was not only to understand how Canadian soldiers or military personnel needed to overcome an Arctic or a northern climate, but it was also research that was conducted in order to understand potentially the capabilities of the enemy, right? Northern Canada and the Arctic, from a climatic point of view and perspective, was considered by scientists at the time similar territory, similar geography, with similar military challenges to areas of Northern Soviet Union or other areas of the world with a cold weather climate in that respect. So, unable to peer through the Iron Curtain, lacking information on Soviet military training, one of the methods to actually understand Soviet military capabilities, again, in an Arctic environment or climate, was to study the limits of Canadian personnel and to conduct this research as such. So it's viewed very much as a way to prepare, again, for a potential battlefield of the future, not only to understand the capabilities of your own personnel, but very much to understand the enemy forces as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Oh, we'll take this question here and then we'll switch over to Zoom for a minute.
I lost track. The Defense Research Board still exist?
Yes.
Okay. Were they involved in the cruise missile testing at Cold Lake?
Excellent question. Cold Lake, with respect to actual cruise missile testing, if that was conducted under the purview of the Defense Research Board, I cannot say specifically, but I do know that yes, scientists and engineers with the DRB were involved at research at Cold Lake. But whether or not they were involved specifically with the cruise missile testing, I can't say.
Alrighty, let's shift gears towards some of the Zoom questions. So William Balding is asking, were there any weapons or equipment that stood out as failures in the Arctic?
Thank you very much for that question. On one of the slides, I showed an individual soldier wearing snow goggles, face masks or goggles as such. They failed. They did not work, in part because the soldiers and then the individuals who were actually using that face or that headgear claimed that the materials made predominantly of different forms of metals, not necessarily plastic, were an issue in the cold in that respect. So scientists and engineers would certainly rely on the firsthand experiences of the soldiers and the actual individuals who were using equipment and kit in these types of environments. So certainly clothing in that respect did fail very much so.
Wonderful, thank you. Alex Suchin is asking, did they do any research on climate science at Fort Churchill, such as ice core sampling or measuring sea ice and surface temperatures, et cetera?
Yes, great. Thank you very much for that question, Alex. It's great to hear from you. There was certainly a significant amount of geophysical research performed at Churchill. I mentioned during my talk that Churchill is an area of maximum aurora activity. So understanding, of course, the impact of magnetism on military equipment in that respect. There was also a significant amount of permafrost research, as you can imagine, understanding not only, of course, the Arctic landscape, the tundra in that respect, but understanding the difficulties of military personnel trying to traverse over that territory. So there's a significant, yes, amount of permafrost research. Also, a lot of research with respect to Hudson Bay and understanding cold or Arctic waters in the immediate area as well.
Wonderful. I've currently got one more question for you from Zoom here. Derek is asking, can you find specific cases where the research at the time was used to modify Canadian military programs and training?
So with respect to the actual, I think that's, first of all, it's a great question. So thank you very much for that. In terms of actually modifying training, yes, we know based on records that have been made available, either through access to information or otherwise. I mentioned during my talk that there were experiments with regard to morale that was focused on the soldier experience, but as well as their commanders. That information and that data would actually go in to revise policies with respect to the operational capabilities of soldiers in a northern environment on cold weather exercises, winter warfare in particular. So yes, there is some evidence that research with respect to how the actual soldiers would have experienced a northern environment or setting did actually change operational capabilities and the thinking towards military tactics and strategy, again, in a potential cold weather battlefield.
Okay, wonderful. I think we'll turn it back to the room for a few more questions. There's one over here.
Thanks for your talk, Matt. It's been incredibly interesting. Did you, as you were doing your research, did you ever encounter evidence of the Canadian research scientists contemplating, considering the moral or ethical implications of their research, particularly with respect to Indigenous peoples? I might ask the same question in terms of the moral and ethical dimensions of what they were doing in terms of research with the soldiers as well. But I'm wondering if you had a sense of whether they had an awareness of the potential negative moral and ethical implications of what they were doing.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kevin, for that very important question. It's one that I certainly struggled with during the course of my research. I'll establish a little bit of context. Of course, at the end of the Second World War, we have the Nuremberg trials. But in Canada, the federal government does not actually establish laws or policies with respect to research ethics involving human subjects for quite some time, not until the late 1970s and into, the early 1980s. So we have this gray period between the end of the Second World War, between the Nuremberg trials, and between the establishment of laws governing medical research ethics in Canada in the late 1970s and 1980s. In the interim, the individuals who made those decisions were the scientists themselves, right? This was not research that was performed, as we would recognize as important today, with informed consent, right? Rather, the ethical or moral responsibilities and considerations, those were the responsibility of the scientists and the engineers and the military officials who agreed to this research and who asked soldiers to volunteer to participate in these experiments. Those officials and those soldiers and those military personnel put their faith in the scientists to make those decisions with respect to moral or ethical considerations. So yes, that was there with respect to soldiers. He also asked the question or raised the question, what about the ethics of the race-based research that was conducted involving Inuit with respect to cold weather acclimatization? The other consideration there, of course, is the issue with language and the language barrier. We know that scientists that were funded by the Department of National Defense, the Defense Research Board, as well as the Department of National Health and Welfare and other bodies of the federal government, they would use translators in their communications, in their correspondence with Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples were involved in research and had samples taken from their bodies, urine analysis, blood, and organs. I mentioned there was liver biopsies, for instance, in some cases of the research. As part of that research, yes, there were translators, but the details about any consent agreement between researcher on one end and subjects, those details are murky at best. So again, we have this gray area in the period where scientists such as Malcolm Brown, Alan Burton, Luther Bigelow, and others who were conducting this research, those were the individuals making those decisions. And unfortunately, the details are murky at best and they're difficult to describe. Was the research unethical in the context of the time? According to Canadian law, no. According to Canadian morals or values, I think we can ask that question. Certainly, these are scientists and individuals who treaded on morally questionable grounds. I think it's safe to say that. And I think it's important to note that as well. Why did they make those decisions? Why was this research conducted? Because of the threat of the Cold War. Because this was information that was thought not only important from a scientific point of view, but from the perspective of Canadian security and national defense. There was a risk assessment, and yes, that risk assessment was one that was made primarily by the scientists who performed the research.
Alrighty. Yep, go ahead.
Thank you, Matthew, for a very interesting talk. So as climate change is happening and Arctic is changing much more rapidly than anywhere on the globe, so as a scientist, so we are discussing the needs of science strategies, Arctic science strategies plan to keep up with the changes that is happening, and if we know the best strategies to study Arctic in this changing climate. Is there a similar discussions around defense, Arctic defense and security because of this changing climate change?
Yes, certainly so. Thank you very much for that important question. I'll speak specifically, of course, to the context of my research, which is the Defense Research Board, now Defense Research and Development Canada, which still holds annual exercises in areas of Northern Canada and the Arctic. Those exercises are a little bit different than the context that I mentioned during my talk. Many exercises today are held in connection with the Canadian Rangers and Indigenous forces, Indigenous peoples in Northern Canada and the Arctic. But many of these same considerations are there, where scientists are involved in decisions with respect to the changes of the defense and the change in security needs in the Arctic. Now, a little bit different, but it certainly connects as well, is the context and how we perceive the security threat in the North, right? As late as 1969 and 1968, the end of the 1960s, scientists in the Defense Research Board advocated placing nuclear reactors at the center of Hudson Bay in order to gradually warm the waters of Hudson Bay to melt the Arctic ice cap, because Hudson Bay, of course, is connected to the Arctic Ocean. The reason they advocated that was to ameliorate the northern environment, to make it warmer for the purposes of social and economic development. That is drastically opposed to how we consider and perceive challenges or issues with respect to protecting the Arctic environment and climate today. The other big difference and big lesson learned was with respect to the interests. And I mentioned, of course, Indigenous peoples, the inhabitants who live in these areas, who have knowledge and, of course, expertise. But that is not just a question of Canadian expertise from the outside looking in. There's a great deal of international cooperation in the military context And one thing that we see that is a continuation from the Cold War in the context of understanding the military and strategic challenges of the Arctic is the question that was referred to earlier in the NATO context, exchanging information. That is increasingly difficult, of course, in the digital age that we live in, not to mention, of course, the rise of AI and what that might mean in the military context. What role might scientists or engineers or others play in Canada in the future? I don't have a crystal ball, but I do know that through Defence Research and Development Canada, those scientists, those engineers, those individuals with expertise in a wide variety of fields are there, and they are working in cooperation with the military to understand the evolving challenges with respect to the Arctic. And that includes, more importantly, again, Arctic inhabitants or residents of Northern Canada and the Arctic in a way that it didn't during the early Cold War.
So we've got time for one more question, which I will take off of Zoom here. One of the questions here is, how easy is it to access sources surrounding defense science? And are most of them now available to historians?
Important question. There is no, like any good historical question, there is no clear answer. Part of the challenge depends on which period you want to study, right? One of the reasons that I was able to ultimately research and write this book is because I was tapping into records of the early Cold War. Now, Canada has a complex system with respect to access to information. Records that are transferred from the Department of National Defense or another government body and transferred to Library and Archives Canada might be closed. Those records will stay closed until someone in the public, such as a researcher or as a historian, makes a request to actually gain access to those records. I was able to do this research, fortunately, because a number of analysts in Ottawa reviewed my request over a series of years and did release records that were previously closed or classified. The challenge with that, though, particularly for junior scholars or graduate students, again, is the time, right? In the US and the UK, there could be a 30 or 40-year rule for the release of military records, defense records. In Canada, we don't have that rule or sunset clause. Records stay closed, and they're not necessarily open in full. When records are released, there might be information that may be redacted. So it's certainly a challenge to navigate Canada's access to information laws with respect to historical research. It's one that takes a lot of time and a lot of training, and it's one that certainly I hope that there's change in the immediate and certainly in the short-term future. But right now, I would say it's possible to do this research. I don't want to deter graduate students or anyone who is interested in military research in the context of the Cold War. Pursue access to information. I'm like a dot on a bone with research. And I think that's necessary in this context. It shouldn't be, but it is. And I think it's important. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for, this concludes our question and answers. We've still got quite a few questions, but I think we're running a little short on time to get to all of them. Thank you all so much for your wonderful questions, and thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation and for patiently answering so many lovely questions. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to everyone online as well.
Just before we end here, I would like to remind everyone that purchasing information for Dr. Wiseman's book, Frontier Science, from University of Toronto Press is available on the PowerPoint, and a link should be in the Zoom. If you would like to purchase a copy in person, then we do have some copies available over in that corner of the room. And finally, our next speaker series events is the 26th of November, 2024, next month. It is a Tuesday, and Tim Cook will be speaking about his new book, The Good Allies. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you.